Hey, I am here with none other than the one and only Pastor Carl Lentz from Hillsong, New York City.
Hillsong, Detroit. Yep.
Hillsong, Detroit. Let's go. Let's go. This is your second time, you said, in the Detroit area?
Second time, but never downtown like this. So it's really beautiful. It's quiet, obviously, because of the pandemic, but it's Detroit. It's beautiful.
Yeah. We're so thankful that you're here. Means the world to us that you come. I know you got a lot going on, and you could be in a lot of places, so we appreciate it. I think a lot of people, our church included, have watched from a distance what's happened at Hillsong in New York, and Hillsong across the globe too, but specifically in New York, and just so much admiration, so much inspiration. And I remember back, like when Hillsong was starting, I was even talking with a couple buddies. We were like, we want to go to New York and plant a church. And then you guys went, and it just blew up. And a lot of people at the time said it was a graveyard to plant. So, like, how did New York come on the radar, first of all? And then I'd love to talk with you about seeing a spiritual renewal in a city.
So, firstly, any church planners that want to do that, they should still do it. You know how it is in Detroit. If you really plan a church, you don't really feel competitive or insecure because if you really love a city, you're like, we're not going to reach everybody. Yeah. So, if anybody's out there, come on, plant a church in New York, do it. We need you. But Brian and Bobby had always had, the U.S. in their hearts and had never done anything. And when I was in Bible college 20 years prior, Joe Houston, who's a struggling songwriter, some may know, he and I, been best friends for a long time, and we said, if your dad ever does anything in America, we got to do it. And we shook on it. We're on a beach, won't forget it, in Bondi somewhere in Sydney. And sure enough, one day he calls me. He said, "You got to come up, meet me in New York, because I'm doing a show up here, but I got to talk to you about something." And I got up there, and he said, "My dad wants to do the first Hillsong church in America. He wants to do it in New York." And I said, "Who's going to do it?" He's like, "I don't know." I said, "Well, whoever it is, let's serve them. Let's be a part of it." And we just felt like, God was in it, and we committed to doing it before we even knew what kind of role we were going to have, because we just felt that strongly that God was in it. And
wow.
So about 10 years ago, we started just going after people and doing what we do. Yeah. And here we are.
So the growth was like explosive, reaching people. Did you ever anticipate that when you went to New York?
That's a tough question, because I say something that sounds really cliche and cheesy, but we felt like we won by obeying. Literally, if we were a failure, in the church eyes, we knew that just by obeying the call, we were good, because that's what God called us to do. Because I don't know if you have a whole lot of control over growth, as much as we want to believe we do. If growing a church big was easy or the goal, I think we'd all see a million big churches. But I think sometimes God just blesses things in different ways. And but I knew in my heart what I saw was this giant, diverse, crazy city. So it would make sense to have a church that reflected that. So my only church goal was like Ephesians 3:20, and I wrote every dream in pencil, knowing that God could erase everything. And so it's definitely been more than we thought or expected, but at the same time, I knew that if we could just get there, the rest was in God's hands. And obviously we've worked hard, done our best, but it's a trophy to God's grace, if anything. Like anything that's still standing, I think that it's a trophy to God's grace, including churches. So it's been a fun ride, though.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredible. Like I said, inspirational to so many. Because I think with you guys, to see a church blossom and flourish in New York, where people said it could never happen, just makes people think this can happen.
Yeah,
and
that church graveyard thing's funny, because whenever church planners go to a city, they always say that we're going to the most least unchurched city in the world. It's like, really? Tulsa was unchurched? But yeah, everyone says that. So it was supposedly, supposed to be just like a place you don't go, because people don't want to hear about Jesus. They don't want to have church like we know it. They're closed off. Just, you hear it all, even though that wasn't true. There's always been good churches in New York, and way before we got there. And but we did feel a little bit of that. But like any city, like Detroit, you guys are here. I'm sure it's not easy. and I'm sure there's some stuff you got to battle through, but you know you're called to be here. So it has been cool to see New York City continually come alive through a lot of churches, and ours included, and you can feel it.
I feel like the whole, spiritual landscape, it seems like, of New York has like shifted since you guys have been there. And I've even seen statistics that overall percentage of Christians in the city has risen.
When Hillsong Church gets there? No, I'm kidding. That's not. No.
So when you, and I've heard you talk about this before, but when you went in, there's so many pastors, church planners, they think in business terms, and they're like, okay, we got to target a demographic. We got to reach this type of person. And so we're going to make this type of church. What was your mindset when you were starting Hillsong?
It's funny. I'm going to talk to your church about that tonight, but ours was, we were so untrained in knowing what could go wrong, or like church analytics, that when people would ask those questions, I would be like, I've never thought of that, because I genuinely didn't know that people were that specific. Because I've always thought the gospel is for all people, all races, all status, all sexuality, all craziness, all wild people, all whatever. Like, we're going to take the gospel to people and let it do what it does. So people are like, are you going after white people, black people, millennials, intellectuals? And our phrase was always, if you have a heart that beats, you're our target demographic.
Yeah.
And people thought that was cute and funny and naive. And then 10 years later, it's the exact same mission statement. Like, we don't care where you're from, completely anonymous or completely famous or a regular person like me, we're coming for you. That's awesome. Always been our thing. So I think there is, I look back on it and I'm like, hey, analytics would have been good. It would have been cool to know something. So I'm not against that. There is a place for data and analytics and studying and wisdom. But if that becomes a prison, I think it can rob you of the supernatural.
Yeah.
Because the analytics and the data of Detroit probably says, don't do this. Don't do what y'all have done. And sometimes you got to go, we appreciate stats, but we're not bound to them.
Right. That's so good. I feel like part of what makes church planting hard to like not get a church started, but to get on the process of planting a church, is that people will be intimidated by the city that they're trying to reach. And it's like, it's too big, and it's too, like the mindset, the worldview is like this. And people get so caught up in that it's almost like beautiful to just be like, this is for anybody. This works for anybody.
Yes.
And not to allow yourself to be so intimidated that you scare yourself out of the process.
I got a good trick for anybody out there who's facing like insurmountable challenge. We found a quick way to flip it or hustle it. So whatever is a boundary or a wall could be a breakthrough. So New York's so big, it's like, that's a lot of people to reach. Transit, it's really hard to get there. That means when you get there, you'll be super excited. There's no buildings. That means God has to provide one. We don't have enough money, which means supernatural resource has to be there, or God wouldn't have called you in the first place. So I actually think that's a habit to take, because the devil is pretty relentless with discouraging things. And if you can get in the habit of going right away, what's the flip of that?
Yeah, that's good.
I think it's a good habit to have. So if anybody is struggling with, you're looking at the wrong side of the mountain.
That's so good. There's a verse in Isaiah that was really significant to my wife and I when we were coming to Detroit. Isaiah, it says that, rejoice, O woman who was not able to bear children. It says, lengthen the stakes of your tent. Yes. For you're going to have children that are going to inhabit the desolate places and the nations. And we really felt like God spoke that verse to us before we came to Detroit. And, like when you think of a desolate place, a lot of people can think of Detroit, and we believe Detroit's best days are ahead of it. We believe that it's bright, but not from the perspective of businesses or economy or whatever, but just from a spiritual desolate place. When you guys planted in New York, that's what people were saying about the city. Yeah. And now it's like become not just a vibrant source of culture for our country, but also spiritual. Yeah. So what role do you think the church, I guess, plays in the formation of a city, of helping see a city be renewed and changed?
I think there's seasons. So I think like we walked into a season where there had been some pretty cool groundwork laid. There were, churches that had been doing an amazing work for a long time, and we just happened to land there along with some other churches and people we love and respect at a time where you could feel it. And I think we've learned how to deal with the seasons. And the more dry it is, the better the water.
Come on.
So if you're like, man, it's a dry season, it's like, well, you have the only thing that's needed. And then in times where it feels like it's a revival, which we have seen and felt and are still in, sometimes you got to go find the dry, quiet places. So it's always this delicate dance of trying to hear the voice of the Holy Spirit, because you never want to get caught up in a revival you're really caught up in, because that's when you start losing, I think, some of the wisdom and some of the things that got you there, because it's like being at a party. That vibe where you forget about the guest, you forget about the stuff that you need, and you always have to be conscious of, this is a God thing, it's a God move. What's my role in it? So if it's going really bad, it doesn't have to bring you down. And if it's going really good, it shouldn't bring you that high. Because if you love it up there, that means you're going to be destroyed should a season change. And that's hard. We've been through those seasons too, where we've had seasons where it feels like everything works. And then there's other seasons when it's like, when is the rapture? Like, this is all bad. But you remember in the good times, we're not going to get caught up in the press of what we're reading. And then the bad times, we're not going to get caught up in the stuff we don't see, because it's the same God every season, same grace every season. And it's really helped us.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
God's given you, a large platform. God's given you a lot of people to reach and to minister. You have influence with people who have influence. But from what I've heard about you, all around, is that you're not a respecter of persons. And I think, maybe that's why God's given you that ability to influence people. But how do you, when it comes to trying to reach the people that God's put in your world, a lot of people that would be their bullseye. Like, oh, if I could just do that, then I would have made it. Yeah. But what is it about you that draws people to you? What is it about you that brings that into your world? Because I think that your heart is that you would reach any person anywhere. And it's,
I think, great question. I think when you do this job, this calling, you have to settle some of that in your heart about who people are against what people do. Because these two things do not often match up. So our world puts a value on what you do as if it affects who you are, but we don't really care. It's cool. I'm conscious of it. So when people try to act like the truth is, a lot of pastors are really insecure. So when they do meet people that is in a certain category for them, and their own insecurity becomes the biggest block. So for instance, it's like if you have, let's just say freaking Blake Griffin rolls into your church. Some pastors would immediately tint up and try to act like he's not Blake Griffin. That's ridiculous. You wouldn't act like that with a man in a wheelchair. You would acknowledge his wheelchair, and you would make sure his wheelchair fit, and you would talk to him. But Blake Griffin, no, I think you got to talk to Blake Griffin like a human. But also, I'm a huge fan. Like, I've never been too cool to be a fan. I've never been too cool to keep it real. If I met a movie star once with Laura, and the first thing I told her was, just so you know, I'm kind of weirdly in love with you. And Laura laughed. I'm like, it wasn't as awkward as I might have said, but I was just like, I think your work's amazing. You're very talented, and we love you here. Now, let's go life. Let's talk life. Yeah. And I think you just got to find out who you are before you try to help anybody else find out who they are. And to me, there's some commonalities in some of those circles, and everybody has that in their world. Mine happens to be sometimes with the athlete or whatever. That's not because I care. It's just because I like sports. And it's an automatic inroad. But if you care a lot about the street that God puts you on, I think your options are limited. But the way I look at it is I want to be always available for whatever street God has for me. So if it's like, hey, you got to go talk to the president, he knows I'm ready because I talked to the president of the bowling club, at the senior citizens home, right? It's the same value. And people will always misconstrue it. Often they look through their own projecting insecurities, and you got to get over that too, because no matter what you do, people are going to think, that's not what you're doing. But we just really love people. And it's really cool to see the gospel, affect whoever touches it. And our church is crazy. New York's just different. And I know one time I was leaving the venue through the back, and I bumped into this guy, and he turns around, he takes his hood off, it's Bono. And I'm like, Bono? And he's like, how you doing, Pastor Carl? I'm like, what are you doing up here? He's like, I don't like going there. I like sitting up here. And I'm like, how long you been coming? He's like, 10 months. I'm like, what? And he put his hood on and he said bye. And I'm like, hey, Bono in the balcony.
What you were looking for?
Joshua Street, next message. It was cool because he felt comfortable doing that. He felt comfortable, And there's another guy that is 7'2" that I know. And he would come to church and he would sit in a little chair in the corner. And I was like, I let him do that for a while. And then finally I said to him, I'm like, man, you need to sit up here so people stop asking you for photographs. And he's like, I don't want to block anybody's view. And I'm like, they'll get over it.
Yeah.
You didn't do anything about being 7'2". You need to be able to stand and worship God like all of us. And trust me, no one's going to mind. So it's just that delicate dance of, and then we have, a lady that had severe Tourette's. And we gave her a really cool spot where she wouldn't feel bad about making noises that sometimes can get side eyes or whatever. And I think that's the local church. It has to be. So when people say, do you treat everybody equal? We say, absolutely not. We treat everybody equal in dignity, but everybody's different. So why would we treat someone who has completely different needs the same as this other person? That's just lazy.
Yeah.
It sounds good to your Christian, vernacular, but it's not reality.
Yeah. That's good. And you say it all the time, like, we're here for the down and outs, the up and outs, and everybody in between. And the gospel works for everybody. And so, Jesus had a similar kind of ministry. He was like rubbing shoulders with everybody. Yeah. And people who didn't like it were most of the time the religious people. So
all the time.
Yeah. When it comes to our city, I always think of that verse, Isaiah 43:19, about, behold, I'm doing a new thing. Now it springs forth. Do you not perceive it? And ways in the wilderness, rivers in the desert. You talked about like a dry land getting filled with water. Just like this moment in the church, like we're in the middle of a pandemic. Now we're in the middle of all of these racial tensions and all this stuff. Like, what do you feel like in the middle of all of it, God is doing in this time?
I think it's an awakening, it's a reckoning, it's a reconfiguration of some people maybe who need to get shifted out so God can bring people in. I think it's an upheaval. I think it's beautiful. I think it's painful. I think it's scary, and it's really peaceful at the same time. Is that enough adjectives for one question? I think, but honestly, that's how I look at it. I just want to make sure that I'm not missing what God's doing in the middle of it. And so to me, I'm always trying to look beyond what I'm seeing, and I try to say, what am I hearing? What is God saying through this? And that's what I see, especially with the racial tension. Someone said to me the other day, we're in the middle of racially tense time. I said, my man, they've been tense.
Right.
You might have just showed up and think that's what it is, but I think when it comes to things like race, I see God doing that because it's an affront to the gospel to have blatant, unconscious, unsaid racism in churches that are talking about Jesus Christ, the one who broke every racial boundary on purpose. And so I think sometimes either we do it through God's help or God does it. And I think that's one of those things where God's doing this.
Yeah.
He's not causing the pain and the stuff, but he's allowing us to see us for who we really are.
Yeah. That's so good. And I think that word awakening is the word for what God is doing right now. And spiritual awakening, yes. Revival, yes. But I've seen people in our own church who, through this whole thing, have their eyes have been open to the anger, the hatred, the racism inside their hearts that they didn't even know was there. And I've also seen those in our church, our black brothers and sisters, who've just been so full of dignity and grace and wanting to work things out. And I just feel like through this unity that comes, that Jesus said, the world will know that I was real when they see you love one another. Yeah. Exactly. And we're the ones, the church is the place where unity should be on display. So thank you for your voice in that. And I'm excited. I know you're going to talk a little bit more about that tonight. Yeah. But thank you so much for coming to Detroit. Thank you for making time for our city and for our church. And
let me tell you this before you. Yeah. I think that you guys are called for a city like this, for such a time as this, and you don't have to be anybody else but who you are. I think sometimes that's a trap. You come into a city and you try to like figure out what the city needs, and that's good to a degree, but God knew that y'all were going to do this before you were born. And there's something to be said for that. So I feel like when cities are in an unrest kind of position or vibe, they need peace, and you have a gift of peace. And I think that's a weapon in these times, and I think you guys are incredible. Can't wait to see what God does here.
Thank you so much. That means so much. Can't wait to have you preach inside this building. It's beautiful. Give it up wherever you watch this from for Pastor Carl Lentz. And make sure, if you haven't yet, Hillsong NYC is online now, so you can also check it out. And we love you guys.
Love you. Thank you.